And now d4, cd4, queen d4, knight c6, queen e4, and d6. Okay. So black has to try to get rid of this pawn, because if it's allowed to remain on the board, it can kind of cause him some problems. So here, knight f3 is strong, defending this pawn. And now pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn. And now if knight takes, queen takes is just very good for white. We're just going to be playing, so if knight f6, we just play bishop g5 and rook d1 next move, and this is very good. So instead, black usually plays knight f6 here. And now we kind of go into this endgame of sorts, where we play knight takes c6. So if knight takes e4, knight takes d8 is good. So black plays queen b6 here. And now just queen f3 and bc6. Okay. So here, white, has a very slight advantage simply because his pawn structure is superior. He has 2 pawn islands, 1, 2, to black's 3, 1, 2, 3. So again, white should slightly be for choice here. It's also possible to actually sacrifice a pawn in this variation. I'll show you that just quickly. I recommend just playing this, but if you guys want to be adventurous, you can play the Kasparov pawn sacrifice of e5, knight g8, and playing knight f3 immediately. So this entails a pawn sacrifice, because after knight c6, you play d4, and then take, 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 and then the idea is to play knight bd5. Sorry, knight d b5. Yeah. So the idea is you just accumulate a developmental advantage for a pawn. So you have play moves like either bishop f4 or bishop e3, and depending on where, oftentimes they play a6, and then you can sometimes play like bishop b6 and stuff like that. So yeah, like d6, bishop f4 is strong. So a6, knight d6, check, take, take, f6, bishop e3, knight e7, bishop b6, and this should be good for white. So the queen is trapped. So the only way to get out of this is to play knight f5. But now queen c5, and again, this should be strong for white. So it's a little riskier because you have to kind of play down a pawn for a while, but you do have development advantage. It's very hard for black to get this bishop out. So okay. So again, let's look at d5 here instead of c5. So again, it's c4, knight f6, knight c3, e6. And now, to avoid the nimzo, we're going to play e4. And now let's see what happens if black plays d5 right away. So a couple of choices here for white. But probably most testing is to play e5. And now black has 2 choices. He can either play knight e4 or d4. So if he plays d4, then simply ef6, dc3, bc3. And then queen takes f6, d4. And now, so this pawn formation is actually not that weak. But if black can kind of mobilize his forces quickly, he should be able to equalize. But only the move e5 probably allows him to do that. So If he plays, a more normal move like, I don't know, say b6 or something to develop this bishop, then we just simply play knight f3, bishop d3, queen e2, castle, eventually bishop e4. And then the idea is, for white, is to eventually use this pawn to kind of break open lines on the queen side. So oftentimes this pawn will eventually play like a4, a5, and then we'll end up being able to play like a takes b6 at some point. So when you have this type of pawn structure, you always want to try to use this pawn as a battering ram to kind of open up lines, especially since it's isolated. But yeah, this should just be fine for white. And yeah, so e5, and now you don't want to be greedy and try to win this pawn because you just want to continue developing. There's no reason not to develop here. So knight f3, ed4, and now rather than recapturing this pawn, we'd like to gain a tempo on this queen. So if you can never develop a piece while gaining a tempo, by all means you should. So bishop g5 is a nice little Zwischenzug, which gains us a tempo and gives us development. So you might think, okay, well, why not queen e6? Well, queen e6 is fine.
Check.
But again, we're developing our pieces. So bishop e2, and of course, don't let pawn takes pawn happen because of
checkmate.
As a nice lady says, it's checkmate. So obviously that's no good. So bishop e2 is fine, and so bishop e7, cd4, and this is just pleasantly slightly better for white. I mean, he has more space in the center. His pieces are better developed. He's about to get castled next move. I mean, the only thing you can say for black's position is that his pawns are slightly more compact. So, I mean, there's a very slight advantage, but I mean, white can never be worse here. So this is what happens after d4. So let me just show you quickly the knight e4 line, which is what happens after this. So this also entails a pawn sacrifice. Again, not necessary to accept it. You can simply just play knight f3, and this position is fine for white. Absolutely fine. So if knight takes c3, for example, we play dc3 in order to get this bishop out. Bishop e7, queen c2, c6, bishop d3, establishing this battery. So now dc4, bishop c4, knight d7, castle, queen c7, e1, b6, and queen e4. And again, white's slightly better just because this pawn is kind of giving black some problems. Although eventually black should be able to play bishop e7, c5, and be okay. But white's definitely slightly better here. So the simple knight f3 is good, but if you want to kind of make black prove something here, you can take on e4, and then queen g4 is the idea. So now this pawn is pretty much lost. So the way that black gets compensation is that he plays knight c6, then after queen e4, he plays queen d4. Okay, so the idea now is that we're threatening queen takes e5 as black, so we have to take pretty much. And now, to defend against this fork, we have to play king d1. So, so here just bishop d7, d3, bishop c6, and black's getting his pieces out a lot easier than white is. But this should still be roughly equal. Maybe slight plus to white if he can kind of organize his forces. But yeah, I mean, simple development also works there too. So okay. Now let's go to the kind of heart of the English, which is the real English. So the real English is basically characterized by what happens when black copies white and plays c5. So a lot of choices here. A lot of choices here. So depending on what white wants to do. So sometimes white will want to play knight c3 and g3, and again just try to hold on to this d5 square. So that's one way to play it. Another way to play it is to play knight f3 and try to get in a quick d4. So you play knight f3, knight c3, and just play d4 as quick as possible. Another way to play it is to allow black to play d5 by playing knight f3 and knight c3, and then black plays d5. All sorts of stuff. So what I'm going to recommend for you guys as a simple thing is to play the symmetrical. So knight c3, knight c6 to play g3 here. And then oftentimes black will just copy g6, bishop g2, bishop g7. Okay. And now here is where it gets tricky. So now basically white can never get this in, black can really never get this in. So the question is what to do. Because oftentimes, d4, d5 is very common in these English positions, but in this one in particular, it won't be even possible. So here, I would recommend for you guys the kind of paradoxical a3. So the idea is we want to generate some play on the queen side. So our idea is we want to play b4 quickly. Yeah, even with e3 though, we still can't get in d4 is the problem. But we can get in b4. So if we can get in b4, we can. So the idea with b4 is to kind of attack the queenside pawns and get some more scope for our bishop, maybe by playing b5 and chasing this knight away. So for example, if black plays something like b6, we can actually play b4 right away, because after take, this knight is pinned, so it can't take the pawn. And now with something like d6, now rook b1, knight f6, and now a typical idea for this opening is that we want to bring all our pieces to d5. So particularly our knight. So how does this knight get to d5? Well, it's not going to be able to get there from f3, its most natural square. So the actual way to do it is to play knight h3 here. So knight h3, knight h5, d3, castle, knight f4. Whoops. Okay, that was not what I meant to do. So knight f4. Sorry about that. So knight f4. Knight takes f4. Bishop takes f4. H6, queen c1. Again, similar ideas. And now king h7, b4. And this should be good for white. So this queen c1 was a nice idea. Double prong, defending this and attacking this. Okay. So hold on a second. So anyway, back to this. Sorry about that. G3, G6, bishop G2, bishop G7. Okay, so A3. So the idea is to play a quick B4. And so if so again, like if D6, like I said, so rook B1 to prepare